When Anne brushed her toes along the surface of the water of her bathtub, it was cold, probably from the water heater that had not yet warmed up, or probably from the smooth permanence of the porcelain that was perpetually cold despite the weather outside. It was July, and everything felt cold in relation to the burning sun. No, it's too cold, she said to herself as no one was in the house other than her and the freezer of carcasses she toted around, her own dead bodies to represent each second of her passing life as she had died repeatedly from birth to now, the planning of her death, taking her own life under the suffocation of water and a bottle of Vicodin to subdue her into drowning, beautifully and without pain. Please, no pain. She always feared pain and would go to any means to keep pain away. The pain of life, inevitable and constant for everyone, was the fear that continued to pull the freezer of her own carcasses behind her. The sharp pangs rippled and crushed from her present body through every carcass in her tracing freezer, and she would never shake the cold. The cold is painful. Juan was a mailman toting his own baggage of dormant thoughts and communications, grocery sales, pizza place flyers, bank statements, letters from grandchildren to dead grandparents whose children never told their children of death because they did not know how, because they did not want to break innocent hearts. But one day the grandchildren would learn the truth of death and the coldness of life, and grow to learn resentment of the parents who had only wanted to spare and prolong their children's innocence. But they would become as cold as Anne, with their own freezers of carcasses to follow them with fear as the wheels. The dead hope of these letters did not weigh any more than Juan's own freezer, as each letter came with cold carcasses of their own, innumerable dead weight condensed into a post office satchel. Juan walked his deliveries in a radius of 2 miles from the post office. 2 miles left, 2 miles up, 4 miles right, 4 miles down, 4 miles left, and back up, trailed by his mistakes and sullen dwellings. Adding to the weight, a fifth of wild turkey sloshed between the satchel and his stomach, so Juan was sun and liquor warm because he was cold. With Juan walking slowly in the sun, the uric salt sweat spread-crawled over his postal hat and uniform, smacking his chest and back in cold patches as he shifted from foot to foot among his carrying weight. Juan's head was downturned in a haze of heat, liquor, and freeze. As the Vicodin dissolved in her stomach and soaked into her bloodstream, Anne became fearful, first in her gut, then in her head. She became numb, feeling no pain, and that was terrifying. What life is there without the pain she constantly ran from? Without pain there was no need to run, and all she knew was to run. As her heart slowed, her blood pressure dropped, and her hands became cold. With her back to the water and feet floating on the bathroom floor tile, Anne sat naked on the benched lip of the bathtub, swirling the water with the fingers of her right hand in thin figure eights, slow like her body rhythm buzzing in a low frequency of painlessness. The sound of the static pour of the water faucet matched the dull, smooth waves in Anne's head. The cold of the water now felt only as an extension of her hand, as if her illusory sorrow emptied from her fingertips and pale blue eyes. Overheating, but without sweat, Juan trudged up the sloped volcanic avenue, the distribution of cold mail not lessening the dead weight from over his shoulders, the moisture on his calloused and ringed face more like tears than perspiration. His breath was thick and heavy with dehydration and alcohol phlegm. Without physical pain to occupy her thoughts, Anne's mind began to wander under the washed meditation of the warming water and thin figure eights. The water heater now added to the silent whir from beyond the yellow-tiled walls and had reached into her chest cavity, compounding the visceral sensation of a void. His back and left side were bluely illuminated from the filtered sun through the high-walled bathroom window. Anne wandered about death, her death, and what was to come of her drowning. Not the discomfort of the hot water filling her lungs, or the tingle of her nerves squirming in instinct to reach over and pull her from danger, from her death. That much she had contemplated, perhaps 1,000,000 times as she fell asleep. Now, naked, lit by the midday blue in the otherwise dark bathroom, slowly sloshing the hot water between her fingers, Anne thought of her afterlife fate. What will become of me? Her body would bloat. Her mind would bubble and pop under the pressure, but where would her soul go? Does the soul know temperature? Without realizing it, Juan groaned with each step as an old wheelbarrow rusting at the axles, but his wheels turned over and over, end over end. His groans seemed to start in his eyes and escape from out his sandy mouth and nostrils. Ultimately, in each present body, Juan was innocent, but haunted by the mistakes of his dead carcasses, the bad choices of his past, the inconsistencies of his character and person, yet each cold carcass was actually innocent, only pronounced dead by time, pronounced evil by relative hope, which only grew cold but were once very warm, full of love. But Juan held onto the freezer like a buoy in an open sea, not realizing his grasp for life was him clinging to death. His steps were forward but rooted in going backward. So Juan drank and lived inside a bomb with a short fuse, where he held the match that he struck to light the way, but only found explosions at every sulfuric flicker. His body as the wick burned slowly under the July sun, and his carcasses coldly traced behind him. Bad memories came to Anne. Hands of the past reached out to her in the blue sun tumult of the day-dark bathroom, hazily reflected in the steaming bathtub water, cold pink and gold arms aggressively stretching toward her blue high-lit body. "Not like this," Anne said. "I can't leave like this." The misfortunes of greed caressed her navel, lips, and eardrums, selfishness a beast she never could rein as the ego propagating her chain of carcasses. She then realized that the mind is a filter of the soul, directing the energy and focus of life. If one were to focus, heaven and hell could be found along its wavelength, oscillating through phases of anger, fear, and joy. Sitting on the cold porcelain, hot overflowing water flapping around and down her thighs and calves to spread over her feet and out along the warm purple tile, Anne noticed her wavelength was deep in the trough of hell, in the reveries of defeat, the disintegrations of love and joy, the thieves of pain and dealers of pleasure, where understanding died in the self and person and remorse depressed vitality. Without sensation but full filth, Anne cried. Each tear shrunk back a cold carcass caress. Anne abruptly rose to her feet, warm in the slippery steaming water, grabbed no towel and assertively walked out the bathroom door with cold tears and warm trailing footprints. Pushing forward against a constant slope, Juan's salty coughs were pacified by periodic swigs of turkey, so the phlegm grew thicker, stuck in the convergence of his sinuses behind his bulging and squinted eyes. He hacked, he snorted and swallowed, he heaved, but nothing relieved his discomfort, feeling the growing infected mass seep up and around his eyes and nose and clog his throat and ears like the freezer he was too afraid to just let go. He swigged at the turkey, loosely closed the cap, and placed it in his bag among the hopeless letters. Anne stood in the living room of her home, the sullen weight of her bowed shoulders transferred down her arms to dripping fingertips and horizontal rivulets soothingly cascaded around her legs to a pool of warm water at her feet. She stared out the window onto a street where nothing moved, and the late yellow sun splashed through the design of her window panes. The shadow of a cross lay diagonally over Anne's bare chest. Quietly approaching the window, the cross of the window pane grew to shadow her face and shoulders, and as Anne gazed down the street, she saw Juan approaching from the neighbor's mailbox. Juan pulled the mail for Anne's house from his bag along with his turkey, which had dribbled out nearly all the remaining liquor and soaked through the depth of his mail. Angry and his hands slick with alcohol, Juan threw down the bottle where it smashed into 4 jagged pieces amongst sporadically clustered slivers of glass. He let the mail fall from his hand over the mess and groaningly stumbled forward up the sidewalk, wetly coughing and heavy, angry breath loosening phlegm. Not having heard the glass break, Anne bursted out her front door and into the yellow sun with a glass of water, naked and barefoot, running over tiny red pebbles to the sidewalk where she stepped and sliced her foot on the broken liquor bottle. Juan had stirred at the sound of the front door banging open and saw Anne on the floor, clenching her hands over her foot, blood squishing out between her fingers, and he did not move. The heat and alcohol hazed his thinking, then fear of blame made him turn and run. "No, please help me!" He heard Anne's pained cry and his heart stopped him. He turned and ran back. "How are you doing?" He stood over her, blocking the sun. "Help me!" Crying and shaking, Anne opened her hands to show a chunk of glass embedded in the arch of her foot. "Fuck!" Juan bent down to pick Anne from out of the glass. He carried her through the open door and into the living room, now flooding, and walked towards the sound of the running water to find the bathroom. As steadily as his drunken legs could, Juan lowered Anne into the flooded bathtub, the dense blood blossoming as her foot submerged. He shut off the water, threw off his satchel, and grabbed the towel from over the sink. Anne clenched her teeth and groaned in pain and panic. Towel in hand, Juan pulled her foot out of the water and looked at the invasive glass. He shot a glance at Anne. "Breathe. Don't look. Just breathe," and yanked the glass from her foot, and blood flowed in paroxysmic surges down her ankle and onto the towel. I'm sorry, and Juan cried. To clear away the blood, he dunked her foot in the water and pulled it back out. He reached into the gape to check for glass and felt a shard deep in the tissue. Anne's body jerked, and her foot lunged into the stained water, eyes closed and face wringing. She smashed her fists and forearms into the porcelain and tile. I'm sorry. Juan's face and hands were sloped in disoriented purpose. "There's more inside. I have to get it out. I'm sorry." Juan pulled her foot out of the water, and Anne resisted very little. He held her toes and ankle in his hands, bent his face forwards toward her foot, and began sucking at the bleeding gape. With suction on his tongue, Juan worked to free the glass shard, and in little nicks sliced the tip of his tongue. Anne writhed and groaned in his ear. He felt and tasted the strength of her body. As Juan sat up and let Anne's foot fall back into the water, his face of effort and painful compassion washed blood from out his mouth, between his teeth, down his chin and neck. To the side, he spit out the grainy shards in red amorphous gobs. Juan tightly wrapped Anne's foot in the towel. She winced, exhausted and ebbing in consciousness. I'm sorry, Juan panted. I'm sorry. Eyes loosely open, Anne grabbed for Juan. He took her hand and bowed his head forward with his brow over their knuckles, crying, I'm sorry. Subsequently, and in a wave like a zipper, Anne's and Juan's trains of frozen carcasses reached out to hold the hand of their counterpart, flowing backward through time, through guilt, through regret, sorrow, loss, and disappointment, unified, accepted, and embraced by the universal pains of life, and warmed by one another with spontaneous and unquestioned love.